Good afternoon. I'm Deborah Ball, and as I was introduced about me earlier, I've been a classroom teacher for a large part of my career as an elementary teacher. I'm currently the Dean of a School of Education, but what I'm going to talk about today, I think follows pretty nicely on what we've done. I'm going to take the title of this session, which was Education Research and Teacher Unions, What are the Rules of Engagement? And I'm going to organize my comments around two problem spaces of practice and policy. One where I have a strong case experience in what happens in the intersection of different stakeholders and with research and teacher unions and the worlds of policy and practice. One of these cases, I have strong case experience, and I'm going to use that to base my comments. And the second one is one in which I have great hope for another example where I think we could make progress based on principles from the first case. So, in the problem that I'm going to talk about, one reason it's sort of a natural one to talk about is what I'll tell you about what happened, but it's also the case that in this work I was doing, which I'll explain in a moment, two of the most frequent questions that I would get were, what do the teacher unions think about this, or won't the teacher unions object to this? So the title, as I said, of this session is What are the Rules of Engagement, but I'm going to change it slightly to talk about what I think the principles of engagement are instead of rules. So the first case that I'm going to talk about, in which I have substantial experience, starts with the passage of the law on teacher tenure in Michigan, in which teacher tenure, it was possible to refire teachers. You could revoke tenure. This was in 2011. And this law, which clearly has many ramifications, but among them was that there wouldn't be a way to, quote, fire bad teachers because there was a completely defunct teacher evaluation system. So the law also contained the imperative that a council be established, as has been done in many states, to rebuild and re-recommend the policy on educator evaluation in the state of Michigan. I was the chair of that council, and it's through that case that I want to talk a bit about the interplay between teacher unions, research, policy, and practice. So I'll tell you just a little bit about this Michigan case because it is both very similar to other states but also very different. One way in which it's similar is that it's all wrapped up in attitudes about tenure. It's also wrapped up into myths about bad teaching, which again, sort of you look at the research, there's literally no substantiation for the idea that there's some large number of people in classrooms who are wicked and ought to be fired, but rather, as our council chose to approach it, that many teachers in this country could be doing better work than we are, and that there's no system that's at all in place to help people improve their work the way there is in other professions. So we chose to reframe the question about educator evaluation into an improvement-oriented approach. We drew heavily on research. I'll tell you just a little bit about that and then draw my principles out of it. So first, one thing that was different about the Michigan approach was not only that framing around improvement rather than punishment and firing, but that the council was established not to represent every alphabet soup organization in the state, but only had 5 members. And the 5 members among us, we had 49 years of teaching experience in Michigan public schools, but we were currently in roles that were none of us public school teachers at this moment. However, there was an advisory council that included 30 organizations like the Parent-Teacher Association, both the unions, all the professional organizations of administrators and teachers and so on, the intermediate school districts, many different organizations which importantly had stakeholder claim to the development of the policy recommendations were an advisory group on whom we drew heavily. However, the 5 of us brought expertise in school leadership, in research on instruction, in research on teacher learning, in measurement of instruction and evaluation. And that composition of expertise was one that initially, at least, the legislature deeply respected. So we were appointed by the governor and by the legislators. Let's not talk about the Michigan governor today because we're actually talking about a different phase of his leadership, not the one having to do with the Flint water supply. But what he did was appoint this very lean council, and we were each appointed by different, the Speaker of the House or the head of the Senate. However, none of us ever knew anything about one another's partisan standing, which was actually quite notable because although it was composed politically, there was no evidence that we'd been selected for our political orientation. In fact, we never knew what each other's political affiliations were, and I doubt very much that anybody who appointed us knew that either. We were instead selected for our expertise in some of the relevant areas. So we worked over a number of years. One of the first things we had to put our foot down has everything to do with research, which is we were being asked to recommend a new policy in something like 3 months. And we weren't even established until about 6 weeks into that 3-month period. So one of the first actions we had to take was to tell the legislature that it was completely impossible to recommend a responsible educator evaluation policy without first doing a pilot study in Michigan in which we would explore the use of different observation tools that are popular around the country, like Framework for Teaching or Marzano, and that we would want to pilot them in a variety of Michigan districts along with different ways to measure student growth. You can predict that the requirements of the law were that we would deliver a recommendation on the teacher evaluation component that included both 50% of teacher evaluations based on observations and 50% on student growth. It was all very poorly specified because the legislators don't actually understand what those things mean. But what we announced was that we wouldn't be able to produce a report without conducting this pilot study, and we were managed to secure on the basis of research evidence that one would need to know a great deal more about how these things look on the ground when they're used by real school districts. We secured a $5 million additional appropriation, which was rather surprising given the budget in Michigan, to conduct a pilot study, which we then recruited a research organization to conduct. That took several months. We actually had researchers analyzing the data about what teachers and school leaders told us about their efforts to implement different efforts to carry out these particular tools. And in the end, we were able to produce a set of recommendations that were really very different than most states. And I'll tell you a couple of things that were different about the recommendations. One was this improvement orientation. So we declined to produce a set of recommendations that would put teachers into 4 categories. That is, ineffective, somewhat effective, highly effective. We declined to do that, but instead created a system in which teachers would be potentially rated as ineffective. That would be the really poor category. That the next category would be called provisional, and the remainder would be classified as professional. And the goal, we argued, would be for all teachers in Michigan to reach a standard of practice that would earn them the category of professional, and that the requirement of our recommendations was that every teacher would get, from each year of teacher evaluation, would get specific feedback and improvement-oriented recommendations from the evaluation that would allow them to make more progress in the coming year, but no differentiations, like no A+ or A or B+. And we based that on the research, which showed that you really only get the best results at the tails of the distribution. So you can identify teachers who consistently are engaged in practice that is not helping kids learn. And you presumably can, under some circumstances, identify people who are consistently getting high results. But we knew from our own teaching experience that that could vary a lot on whether it happened to be what period of the day or what grade level or what subject it was in. So we declined to honor the A+ sort of recommendation. So along the way, so we produced this report, and one of the interesting things about the report was that it engendered extremely broad political support in the state. So what I mean by that specifically was both teacher unions, so we're both an NEA state and an AFT state, both teacher unions endorsed the report enthusiastically. So did legislators on both sides of the aisle, and so did almost every single one of the professional organizations. So this was rather surprising in some respects to get that level of agreement. I want to say a little bit about what some of the research was that informed this work. Sorry, I just lost my notes here. Sorry. So several things I think are important about this. First of all, we organized the work around a real problem, the real problem being that Michigan districts were using a huge variety of homemade tools that teachers felt were deeply unfair and highly idiosyncratic and capricious. And they had the experience repeatedly of principals evaluating them in ways that were spurious and unhelpful to the improvement of their work. So they were open to and enthusiastic about the idea of building a system that was more fair. And the way that we pitched the work was that that was our intention. So that's a real problem of policy and practice. We don't really completely know how to do that. And that created the conditions for a kind of work that used research and also used the expertise of practitioners and the desires of policymakers to produce a set of recommendations. The second thing is we used and interpreted research in the service of solving that problem or of attacking that problem, not to use research or to prove that we were using research, but to use best knowledge about things we genuinely had questions about. So I'll give you a few examples of those without going into the details of them. One would be, how frequently does a teacher need to be observed in order to get a reliable estimate of the skill of that teacher's practice under the circumstances? Turns out to be a policy dilemma, because most studies will show you that you need to observe a teacher at least least 3 times in order to get a stable estimate. The cost of that would be really astronomical for a state like Michigan, which is financially very challenged, and I imagine for many states as well. So we had to manage that dilemma, while on the other hand standing up for the fact that it was unlikely you could get reliable estimates of teachers' practice. But we did know that we used a standard observation tool that we had a better chance of getting a reliable estimate of teachers' skill levels in the evaluation process. And we also knew something, which was that the evaluator would have to have good training in the use of the tool. So many districts we found in Michigan that were, for example, using Danielson, there was no training for administrators. They weren't really using Danielson, they were using little pieces of Danielson. So to call it Danielson was actually fake. So these were some of the things we were able through the pilot study to begin to put to light. Let's talk more candidly about what we mean by using a tool and what it is to use one in a way that would actually give you a fair sense about how a teacher was teaching. Another obviously was the question about VAM and growth. So growth was what was in the law that many people thought meant VAM. It turned out, of course, that nobody really knew what VAM was, so at all, not even a little bit. And as we began to expose and think educatively about what it meant to explain what is VAM, like what does it mean to talk about value-added models, pretty quickly it turned out that you could get VAM on almost no school children in Michigan at all, for reasons that you probably can understand, but I won't go into right now, having to do with what levels we have standardized testing in the state, what subjects are tested, and the like. So that opened up a door to learn more about what other ways are there to measure student growth and what are the ways to track that. And that was another educative opportunity to use research and to think together about, yes, it does make sense, and teachers agreed to think about how well we're helping children to learn. But we couldn't escape the fact that there's no simple bullet that says you can slap a VAM score on and get anything resembling a reliable estimate of what children were growing for many, many, many reasons. And being able to open up the research and learn together about that research helped. Another was merit pay, which legislators were highly fond of, but the research on merit pay is really extremely enlightening about the degree to which merit pay can help to improve practice, what it means to try to use it as a reward, actually creates great complications. So again, there were very sensible things to which we could turn to the research literature and learn with it rather than here's the research, here's what we should do. I think the third principle, so my principles in this case were we organized around a real problem and had buy-in that it was a real problem of practice and a genuine set of dilemmas for policy. The second was we used research in the service of trying to get the work done. And the third is one that I have a less easy time explaining, but I would say basically that we took a third way approach politically, which was these are about Michigan school children. They deserve to have teaching that's good. Michigan's teachers deserve to be getting support in the form of actually useful feedback about their practice from people who know something about that. That was probably the only place where we ran into a tiny bit of trouble of two different kinds. The first is that the only place we ended up with big controversies within the sort of teacher organizations was over the question of expert observers. So some teachers, you can probably predict this, preferred to have teachers who knew something about what they were teaching, who maybe already had earned good evaluations in previous years, be the people to observe them. So the story that ran around Michigan was of a teacher who taught Spanish in high school, describing that her principal came to observe her one day, watched the whole lesson, and then at the end of the lesson said, I'm going to come back tomorrow and I'd like you to teach that lesson in English because I didn't understand anything you were saying. So whether that was true or not, many people could recite stories of being observed by principals who not only didn't have training, but really hadn't ever taught those subjects or those children in that context. So those people really wanted to create in the policy recommendation that teachers could be observed by people who had expertise in what they were teaching and with the learners with whom they worked and such. Others were very worried in an evaluation context of having peers be the evaluators. So that issue didn't ever really get resolved, but instead the policy said it was permissible to go either way rather than stipulating which way it could go. I would say the other thing that's very sad in the end is that I described to you the very broad political support that the final recommendations got, and you can still read that report. It's on the Michigan Council for Educator Effectiveness website. So what was the next task was for the legislature, after this very broad set of sort of support, including from legislators and from their aides and their staffs and from the teacher unions, was to turn it into legislation. But what happened over the coming months as the legislature worked to turn it into policy language was that the Republican side of the the Republicans in the legislature began to worry that if they found themselves in agreement with the teacher unions, there must be something wrong with their understanding of the recommendations. And the whole coalition began to dissolve over something that was fake, because they actually did agree with the recommendations. So in the end, a better policy has been passed in Michigan, not as ambitious or as high quality as the one we recommended, but we did make progress. And I think it's an interesting case in point for what can happen if you organize it around a genuine problem, work respectfully in a third way around things that are of a common interest rather than on things that divide us. You can get something done. Do I think we got as far as I wish we had? No, but I also think we learned a lot about what it can look like to work productively on something. So the problem I wish we could take those principles and work further is the very related one, which has to do with initial preparation of teachers and licensure. Seems to me that this is one of another area in which researchers, policymakers, teacher educators, teacher unions, organizations could come together to take a stand on the very real problem that we have our nation's schools populated with early career teachers who are underprepared for the work. And the very stance that we can take about what it looks like to be someone who is ready to be responsible for children's learning is a professional issue on which I can imagine there being a kind of coalition to come together, and there would be real problems to work through. For example, what is the threshold, not like the things we have in place right now, what is the real practice threshold for someone to be a good enough beginning teacher to be allowed to have a classroom? There are clearly other questions about whether districts might create other systems in which beginning teachers don't really teach full-time, but setting that aside and assuming that many districts will continue to hire early career teachers and give them a full set of responsibilities, what does the threshold look like? What should be the things that people should have to show that they can do, not have completed or know, but do before we let them teach reading to first graders or help English language learners learn physics or whatever it is? What is that? And that's a professional issue around which I can imagine people working together. The second question is, what would the nature of the assessment look like? What would the threshold be like? How could we move away from things that are proxies for that quality of practice to something that we could as a profession think we had taken an appropriate stand for the good of children about what somebody should be able to do. So I'm hoping that some of the experience around the educator evaluation work can spill over and be used to build a coalition around taking a professional stand around something that others are going to make lots of policy about that won't be informed by research, by professional expertise, or by the realities of what's happening, particularly in our urban schools in which children from marginalized communities are being served overwhelmingly by teachers not ready for the work. This is an issue that teacher unions and researchers could come together on which, like with educator evaluation, there's a good deal of research that could inform that work, as well as other forms of expertise that could mobilize the effort. So with that, I'll sit down and hope that those two problems help to illustrate my views about how the principles of engagement around teacher unions and research could be improved and mobilized.